Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to our workshop, to the first session. Before we start our panel, please permit me to apologize for Bruna. On behalf of Bruna, sadly, she cannot be with us today and attend this workshop. She had to leave earlier to attend to family matters, so our thoughts and prayers go out to her. Now, let's start our first session and introduce our first speaker, who is Remec. She is a research fellow at the Institute of Contemporary History in Ljubljana. Having obtained her BA in History and Italian Language and Literature, she gained her PhD in History in 2015. Through her postgraduate study, she has looked into different aspects of everyday life in Slovenia in the bourgeois era, raising awareness for a healthy lifestyle and hygiene among people, and the struggle to fight contagious diseases. She is the author of 2 monographs and several articles. And today she will talk to us about post-war echoes of interim violence, women between rape-caused stigma, and domestic violence after the First World War. The floor is all yours.
Thank you. Hello to everybody, thanks for inviting me. I'm really honored to be here. Today I'm going to present some facts that some of you probably already know, hopefully adding some of mine. I'm going to talk about the World War I period, but as we have seen yesterday, the concepts of trauma, pain, torture are more or less the same for the entire century. So wartime rape is clearly not a new phenomenon. It has always been a part of military conflicts. And in literature, World War I has for a long time been pictured as a conflict during which the civilian population was not subject to the same kind of horrors as during World War II. However, various sources indicate that this was not true, as the governments and military commands were aware that the perfect victory at the battlefield could not be achieved without annihilating the hinterlands that supplied the units at the fronts. So total mobilization reached every aspect of the society, and therefore civilians became a completely legitimate target of military campaigns. The wrong conviction about the nature of conflicts and the role of the civilians in them spread especially on the basis of research which mostly focused on the circumstances in the West, while ignoring the situation on the battlefield situation in the East. None of these crimes, not even the genocide against the Armenians, were paid any major attention at the time by the Western media. This was closely related to the prejudice of the West against this nation. Namely, Magnus Hirschfeld described these crimes taking place at the Balkan fronts with the following words. It appears that among the southern Slavs, sadistic murders, mutilations, castrations, and rapes were very frequent. These peoples have remained behind the rest of Europe in civilization and have retained their primitive traditions. Only during the Great War did they enter the stage of world history. And he makes a list of mass murder, torture, destruction of settlements, fields and other resources, and mass rape. Rape was, according to him, the main method of torturing and humiliating women, and the women remained the only vital segment of the defeated nation. The Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 did not directly address the subject of rape. The Article 46 may have imposed the preservation of the sanctity of family life and private property on the army, but it did not go further. Rape was not described any greater role, as it was not seen as a serious crime worth persecuting. In comparison with the use of chemical warfare, it was not seen as a true war crime. It was just an affront to honor without serious consequences. And according to Hirschfeld, that also resulted from the conviction that women experienced pleasure from submitting and subordinating to men. Rape was supposedly even a part of wartime experience that women secretly desired. Rape was often a part of planned propaganda, so made up, according to him. This was allegedly present especially in the territory of Belgium, where the news about numerous cases of rape served as a tool of promoting hysteria, panic, and hatred towards Germans. They had a psychological effect also outside the Belgian borders, especially in the United Kingdom, Italy, and the United States, where these examples of rape were used as one of the arguments for the necessity of entering the war. Rape during World War I used to take at all battlefields. There are testimonies from all over: Italy, Belgium, France, Serbia, Greece, Turkey, the Eastern Front, so it was widespread. On some battlefields it was like planned and a part of military strategy. On other, we consider in Italy we don't know, or some think like the authors are divided and so on. However, they have been investigated, and the data about the rapes gathered only where there was political interest about it. So rapes were often a handy tool for political disputes. They served as a means to create a myth about the barbarity of the enemy, and they were frequently politically instrumentalized. This is probably the reason why the rapes in Friuli were recorded and later studied, why the rapes in France in Belgium were recorded, and why the Serbian government felt the need to invite a Swiss forensic expert, Reis, his name was Reis, to record the war crimes which was going on in Serbia. We have basically no records of cases of rape on the Slovenian territory. It's a fact that Slovenia was never under occupation, but nevertheless there are only a few rumors, only hearsay about the scandalous behavior of German and Hungarian soldiers, but I did not find any official statistics of this happening. Some priests recorded that there were numerous attacks. They sent those notice to the Archbishop Jeglic, and he in his diary mentions that there were violent attacks, especially by Hungarians, that girls were afraid to leave their houses and work on the fields. So we can collect those bits and pieces from diaries, memoirs, and books like Hofbauer's, who, let's say, testified over the value of meat, sugar, and flour in the Kars region, where women were paying with their bodies. And if the soldier did not have those goods, he could always show his fist and get it anyway. So I believe that these women were victims of their own and allied soldier, so nobody wanted to talk about it publicly, and it was all hushed. It has to be underlined that these double standards existed until the end of the 20th century. In recent history, some authors claim that rape was instrumentalized during the war in Bosnia, where not all rape got the same kind of attention, where the Serb man was turned into the symbol of all rapists and the Muslim woman into the symbol of all victims. Of course, there were fewer rapes committed on Serbian women, but the fact is that Serbian women were the wives, daughters, and sisters of the aggressors. And as one of the female authors has stated, there is hardly a journalist who feels motivated to seek them out, to check up on what has happened to them, and thus offer propaganda material to the Serbian side, that is the bad side, the side responsible of the war. So what we are dealing with is a typically male discourse present throughout history, which treats women as objects, as part of male property, and not as individuals. By focusing the attention on some cases of rape and ignoring all other, the majority of authors have willingly or unwillingly contributed to this male political and military game, in which women are divided according to whether they belong to the good guys or to the bad guys. All this is a clear failure to understand rape in war as an act directed primarily against women. Even a prominent writer as Slavenka Drakulic has written in one of her essays, and I'm quoting her, it should not be forgotten that Croats and Muslims raped Serbian women in Bosnia too. But the Serbs are the aggressors, and their aim is to take 2/3 of the territory. This does not excuse Croats and Muslims, but they are in a defensive war, and at least they do not have organized rape as a political aim. So Serbian women, therefore, were raped in a revenge, and this is somehow understandable even for a female writer and feminist. So men dominated this discourse. In Italy, for example, the statistics of rape after World War I was calculated in the context of a commission recording war damages. These crimes were dealt under the name crimes against women's chastity, which undoubtedly reduced their significance and importance. And the reports were made by the representatives of the local authorities, the majors, their deputies, their local priests, who made a rather big effort to conceal what has happened in order to protect the dignity of the women in their community. Everywhere, the women were often willing to testify immediately after the rape, but the larger was the gap between the rape and the interview, more were they inclined to remain silent. The interviews in Italy, let's say, took place in front of an all-male commission, and the woman often had to prove her immaculate reputation before the rape, explain how and if she did try to defend herself and prove her own innocence. The men who drew the reports were often very proud of the fact that most women did not want to testify due to their strong sense of morality and shame. So my point is that women throughout history were not seen as individual victims, regardless of their ethnicity or the ethnicity of the perpetrator. Basically, you had to be the right kind of women, of the right age, raped by the right kind of soldier, who used the right kind of violence on the right territory to get some attention. And I believe it's also not an overstatement that soldiers were directly and indirectly trained to rape, to hate and later rape women. In the manuals dedicated to the soldiers, published before the war, I find the same image over and over again. It's the innocent recruit who was the victim of the indecent, the corrupted woman who couldn't wait to take advantage of him. Men were warned that venereal diseases would become the weapon of those women and a means to fight the adversary. The women would spread the diseases on purpose to weaken the opponent army. In the articles and manuals, the soldiers were often warned of the damage of the women predators who will not hesitate to take advantage of the innocent lonely men struck by homesickness who crave for love and attention. Soldiers were warned that women will try to extract money from them, food and other goods. In this way, soldiers would become weaker and weaker and the strength of the whole army could drop. And most importantly, women will try to use sex to get information from the soldiers, and the naive ones could put in danger whole units just by saying too much, usually after having sex and in the state of drunkenness. So women were manipulative liars. Women make the men excited. They do it on purpose, and then they humiliate the man by turning him down. I found only a few manuals, I believe 2, in which the author stated that the women should be treated with respect and the feelings that of women should be put into consideration. And I found only one manual entitled Al Soldato Italiano, which was published only at the beginning of the 1940s, so it does not enter into my time frame, but nevertheless. In this manual, rape is dealt. The manual contained advice that women on occupied land should be treated with respect. The author suggests that the soldiers should always keep in mind their own mothers, sisters and wives, and before doing anything or committing any act of which they would later be ashamed, they should think on how would they feel if someone raped their own women. So again, it's all about them. The Austrian soldiers deployed at the Serbian battlefield were trained to fight against the regular army as well as against the guerrilla units. The enemy was hiding in all pores of the society, so even the civilian population was seen as dangerous, including women. And women were targeted by organized violence, especially at the time of the Bulgarian occupation. Their bodies symbolized the biological and cultural tradition, as well as the continuity of the nation. They were seen as dangerous, violent. They were the driving force of the enemy, and they used venereal diseases as a weapon. Therefore, women were exposed to torture, rape, and especially brutal murder, because if men were mostly shot or hanged, women were brutally beaten, killed with butt ends of rifles, bayoneted, burned alive, and so on. Pregnant women were exposed to specifically brutal violence, and in order to all this to happen, women had to be dehumanized. So they were beasts, they were not human people. So whatever you did, it did not affect your conscience, because you were not fighting another human being. The discourse is again interesting, and there is a whole special issue on how Roma women were treated, because they were considered as half people, even by the Serbians. So the Serbian testimonies show little or no compassion over the fate of the Roma. So, and the report drawn up during and after the war proves that systematic and planned violence against women was perpetrated. And rape was considered a symbolic act of humiliating women and their whole communities. But it affected men as well, because there were castrations, there were mutilations, and so on. It has to be stated that other forms of sexual abuse were just as frequent. So the threat of rape, the sexual harassment, the blackmail, sexual slavery, forced marriages, forced impregnations, forced prostitution, prostitution in brothels for soldiers, and prostitution as a survival strategy. Women were abused in areas during the First War, in areas affected by the war, so during war operations and occupation, as well as in areas not directly affected by war. Women were sexually victimized when searched, arrested, interrogated, imprisoned, and so on. And of course, in war as well as in peace, women continued to be raped by the members of their own ethnic group, regardless of the war. So the true question, what has happened to those women since the ordeal ended? There is a huge problem with sources. There are not many sources that we can rely on. So because women were treated brutally, whether they were assaulted during war or not. But however, there are some basic facts that can be underlined. So these are some pictures taken by Rodolf Archibald Rice in Serbia, which proves he collected data about torture and rape. I think we saw them also yesterday. So one is the stigma of the fallen women, because raped women were considered fallen. There was a strong suspicion that they did not know or they did not want to defend themselves. The rape was considered a proof of the weakness of their will. They failed to do their duty during the time in which their husbands fought at the front. They failed to protect their sexual honor, which was their only real value. The loss of virginity, no matter the circumstances, meant that they would never be able to fulfill their role of honest and respectful wife and mother. Venereal diseases were a real threat. They were afraid that they would cause permanent infertility. And they were also seen as the first step of the moral decline of the women. Even among experts, there was a strong fear that the raped women would eventually end up as prostitutes. Raped women were often declined medical attention, they were just told to wash up. And most commonly, when they contracted gonorrhea, let's say, the doctors did not want the raped women to meet the prostitutes which were being treated in the hospitals, as they were afraid that they would just join them because they got the taste of it and now they will not want to stop. And the women who often, due to extreme hunger and extreme shortage of all other goods, ended up selling themselves in order to provide food for the children and the elderly, were not included in these statistics, even if they were actually raped, because there was a strong conviction that a prostitute, in fact, could not be raped. The language used to describe rape is worth of analyze itself. The authors tend to avoid to directly name the act. They talk about violence, profanation, pollution of the fireside, of home and the family, which meant that not only the women were violated, but rather the entire family or even the whole community was offended. They often use the term betrayed. The woman failed her responsibility. She did not think through the consequences of her act, of her behavior. She was too naive and did not know or want to defend herself. The language used to describe the act of rape or sexual violence is telling. Rather than directly stating what happened, the women employed euphemisms and ellipses to express what has happened to them. The men had special feelings. They behaved shamelessly or scandalously. The act of rape offended their identity as proper women and was a part of the category of the unspeakable. So women left gaps. The rape always happened to other women, not directly to them. The incident seemed to reflect on the victim and not on the perpetrator. Women often accepted guilt and did not see themselves as blameless victims of crime. They choose either not to speak about it or use a language which was more acceptable. They often said they have served as wives, not that they have been actually abused continually, which is logical, because even in marriage, women had no right to deny sex to their husbands. Slovenian priests in their manuals say that in some cases of extreme drunkenness of the husband, you had the right to say no, but otherwise you were not allowed to deny sex to the husband. And even inside the marriage, the sexual act was often violent, because violence was considered part of male nature and character. When I analyzed manuals from the late 19th and early 20th century, I found only a few of those, and only the most progressive ones stated that husbands should at least try to avoid violent and sudden penetrations, that they should somehow prepare their wives for what was coming and give her feelings at least some consideration. So this was the women's reality, even before the war. And before the war, rape was usually criminalized only in certain cases. But in all cases, the women's reputation was always considered. Her role in the act was analyzed. If she somehow confused the man, if she somehow accepted the sexual act. And the women from the lowest stratum of the society were not even considered able to make those choices. It's clear, however, that the tolerance towards sexual violence was somehow shrinking, but not towards women during the war, and especially not for the women of the opposite side. In their diaries and memoirs, soldiers admit that they have behaved in an indecent way after the war, but they give the war as an excuse, so the fear of dying, the decadence that was all around them, and so on. When men talk about their wives, daughters, or fellow citizens, in generally they usually say that they either failed or managed to maintain or protect their virtue, and they give the greatest credit to those who managed to come through war clean. So the women who, out of necessity or force, became dirty was stigmatized. We heard already yesterday something about domestic violence, which I found really interesting. It's considered that after the war, domestic violence was widespread, very common. Men and soldiers who managed to survive and came home safely often had a hard time adjusting to the new reality, especially the defeated ones, but also the winners had the impression that they were not welcomed properly. There were no jobs waiting for them. They found themselves displaced with no future, often wounded, disabled, and they could not bear the thought that women had taken their jobs and that women had a new role in the society. Men coming from the front were more keen to use violence. They were often armed, and they represented a true threat for their families. There are some sources about what was going on behind the walls. We heard yesterday from Jelena. I found an article from Maureen Healy, who has written about the situation in Wien. She found letters written by beaten wives to a women's newspaper in which they were asking advice on how to protect themselves and their children. In Slovenian newspapers, we have articles with similar context. Doctors have written about it, famous one, Brezel. And the acts of violence in the Slovenian context are almost without exception linked to the abuse of alcohol, which was rising in that period. The problems are the same. The families are in ruin. War was causing problems. There was a catastrophic influence of the war on Slovenian families. Problems got even bigger after the war. On one side, there were the orphans and the wives, the widows in extreme poverty, who would do just about anything to survive. So mothers were selling their daughters. During and after the war, there was, according to Brezel, this big problem of shamefulness, bestiality, lust, corruptiveness. There was a complete moral decline. Violence has penetrated every pore of the social and family life, and he says that people were just out of control. In those letters, the wives, let's say, are considered lucky if all they got was disrespect, verbal insults and mocking. Alcohol abuse, as I said, was considered the reason for wife and child beating, brutality, even murder cases. The wife was depicted as a victim, although there were numerous cases, numerous articles about fallen women who have lost their moral compass during the war and who continued with their shameful behavior even after the war. They got the taste of the good life of drinking, smoking, and easy money from prostitution, and no wonder husbands went crazy in those cases. The husbands described were heavy drinkers, unemployed, angry, violent men. But these were in fact husbands of women who were not, or probably not, among rape victims. So I have to say I have basically no clue what was going on in the homes of, let's say, Serbian women who were described by Rice. I do not know if they were beaten or not, and if their fates were any different from the women who were not raped. So there are, however, some specific situations that took place after the war that are linked to the women's sexuality, but again, I feel that it had little or no difference whether the women were raped, forced to prostitution because of starvation, or had a sexual relationship with another man. The fact that their wives had sexual intercourse during the man's absence was the cause of huge trauma for the returning soldier, and they did not distinguish between rape, prostitution caused by hunger, and a love affair. After the return home, they were expecting repayment for all those years of suffering, and the women betrayed them, so they were victims. One of those specific situations I was talking about are, of course, the children of the enemy, because one of the most common fears of raped women was the possibility of getting pregnant. There was this old conviction that dated to the 19th century that the conception could not happen without the enjoyment of the women. So an absolute rape was unlikely to lead to pregnancy. So women had to fight against those convictions too. For the period during and immediately after World War I, the case of Friuli is very well known, documented. The degree to which the Italian society was possessed by the issue is also evident by the innovative system developed specifically for this purpose. I'm sorry, Daniel Cheskin is not present, but he has written plenty about it. I think Mura Bianchi also. Children born in marriage, but obviously conceived by rape, needed to be removed from their families, as they ruined domestic happiness and represented an eternal reminder of the humiliation that had befallen the husband. So we know that to address this issue, a special institution called San Filippo Neri was established. It was founded due to the conviction that soldiers who had bravely defended their homeland should be protected from the shame of these children. In these men, the man was protected. The burden of the fatherhood of the children of guilt was removed. And at the same time, the children who would otherwise be exposed to violence, neglect, and even infanticide were kept safe from harm. But in reality, it can be considered more as a form of institutionalized removal of those children, because if I remember correctly, out of 355 children, 205 of them died already in the first 4 years. A large number of unwanted pregnancies all over Europe opened the dispute over the right of abortion, or even the duty of women to commit it. By aborting, the woman was able to protect herself, her family, and the whole nation. It was the woman's way to fight the aggressor. The children of the enemy were considered a threat to the nation. They were the carriers of evil and hate, and even without the ethnic component, as a direct consequence of the way that they were conceived. So even if an Italian soldier raped an Italian woman, the child was destined to become degenerated, criminal, mentally or physically affected because of the way in which the child was conceived. According to the theory of the progressive degeneration, rape was a direct attack on the purity, homogeneity of the nation, and also on the health and order of the society in the future. Even though the rape did not result in a pregnancy, the uterus of the woman was considered contaminated and desecrated, and the results would be shown in the further pregnancies. So, leading Italian scholars, from France, defended the right to abortion. They even went a step forward. They did not consider it only a right, but even a duty for every woman to get rid of those children. There were other scholars who would grant the right to abort only to certain women and not make a general women's right of it, because they didn't know how to stop it then after the war. So the social environment imposed clear demands on the women to get rid of those children. We have some testimonies that Serbian women were abandoned by the husbands in those circumstances. They were often forced to leave the older children with the father's family, the husband's family, while they and the child of the enemy often returned to live with the women's parents or other family members. And okay, I'll stop here because I think I already passed my time. So, thank you.
Thank you, Meta. Our next presenter is Matteo Perissinotto, who collaborates on our Eirene project. And he earned his PhD in history at the University of Trieste in 2016. From 2013 to 2016, he has been involved in the project Der Erste Weltkrieg und die Konflikte der europäischen Nachkriegsordnung 1914 to 1923 at the Zentrum für Antisemitismusforschung in Berlin. And he is the managing editor of the review Quest, Issues in Contemporary Jewish History, and a scientific collaborator of the Jewish Community Museum in Trieste, Carlo e Vera Wagner, and Fondazione Museo della Shoah in Rome. Now he will tell us more about the violence against women in the Julian March, 1918 to 1922. There you go.
Thank you, Dagmar. Good morning to everyone. This talk aims to trace a picture of episodes of violence against women in the Julian March between 1918 and 1922, the transition period between the end of World War I and the official annexion to the Kingdom of Italy. I put them up, but everyone here, I suppose, know the area, but I don't know who comes. So, the research I'm carrying out is based on the collection of data and individual episodes available in daily reports of the Carabinieri, Italian police forces, and in the local press. So, just to have the sources analyzed focus mainly on the urban area of Trieste. You can see that, for example, in this relation, this comes from Trieste, and we have a description that, with the tale of the crime and so on. Here we have a relation from the Istria area, and we have a list of the crimes, so not so deeply with data of women and the perpetrator also. The newspaper examined all in favor of the Italian occupation were reference of different political tendency. The socialist Il Lavoratore, the fascist Il Popolo di Trieste, and the nationalist Il Piccolo and La Nuova. Little has been written on the theme of violence in Julian March, in the post-war transition phase. All the work was limited to evaluating the changes to the legislation and the work of the Italian authorities, not grasping the aspect of gender-based violence. For example, the work of Angelo Visentin, while other studies have concentrated on fascist violence and forced Italianization. I would like to say immediately that the present research is still in progress. Today, I will present an overview and the first data collected. There are many lines of research that have opened up. In this report, I will focus on the following issues. Who were the victims? Places of violence, types of violence and the role of the soldier and veterans, women's reactions, how the political violence that characterized the region between 1920-22 involved women. The first thing that emerged in this is the class aspect. The victims were women of the proletariat, in particular widows, housewives, servants, seamstresses, and prostitutes. There are two exceptions. Victims of violence in Istria, belonging to the family of landowners, and the teacher and post-telegraphist, victims of fascist violence. We can distinguish four zones which, as we shall see, will be characterized by different types of violence and different reaction from the victims. The first one was Trieste, in particular in central districts, already famous in the pre-war years for the violence linked to underworld and prostitution, according to Nancy Griffith studies. In particular, in the first month of the Italian occupation, Trieste was characterized by significant demographic changes and the strong presence of military and veterans. To this factor must be added a strong food, health and housing crisis. And the second is the caste. It is an area with a Slovenian majority, where the military presence was perceived as extraneous both for the lack of knowledge of culture and language, and for the sense of cultural and national superiority that characterized the Italian occupation. Already in January 1920, the military governor pointed out the need to have men at disposal who knew the places, language and custom of the local population, probably in order to avoid disputes with soldiers from the Kingdom of Italy. The third is Istria, characterized at last until 1920 by a scarce presence of authorities and activity of bands of bandits. We can see in this map, it's not so perfect, but it was a map of the Guardia di Finanza, the Custom Corps in 1919, and we can see the red point where the presence of the military, and we can see here in Istria, so it was not so present, also for the type of region, of course. The last one concerns the area close to the border, in particular this area, here, close to Longatico, where there were about 10 cases of killing or injury by Italian soldiers of women who smuggled tobacco, coal and material. These areas were characterized by different types of violence. In the city of Trieste, we can see different elements of continuity with respect to the pre-war and war years. Violence was a daily element in the life of the port city. Violent robberies, thefts at home and in shops, muggings, fights, domestic violence, and violence against prostitutes. What changed in the city was a strong military presence, the return of veterans, and the arrival of employees and laborers from the kingdom. The soldiers were involved in acts of violence, especially in the first months of the Italian occupation. These episodes deeply marked the perception of the new regime by the population, and for this reason the governor immediately tried to limit them. The military commands tried not to spread this news through newspapers. They also tried to avoid fight and violence in brothels, but in spite of these cases, although decreasing in quantity, did not stop. As demonstrated by the life sentence for the soldier Pasquale Malattacca in May 1920, who killed the prostitute Maria Vatta, called La Cigna, near Opatia, Vazia, because she had infected him with syphilis. The prosecution had asked for him to be shot in the back, demonstrating their own fist that the commanders wanted. Domestic violence was marked by episodes that often involved veterans, who did not accept the new sentimental or sexual relationships established by the wives or women that they were involved with before the conflict. For example, an article of the 29th of October 1918 in the socialist newspaper Il Lavoratore, entitled Una tragedia coniugale, a marital tragedy, tells of a man who had returned from the front and had learned of his wife's betrayal during the war. The man killed his wife and committed suicide. The language used by the newspaper tends to justify the murder, while the wife is present as a woman who could not resist, citation, the vertigo of the new feeling and perhaps even great, even if guilty, end of citation. Several of these episodes involved women who were widows during the conflict and who had established new relationships with men, often alcoholics. Many of these women were in the situation of not being able to cut off relationship because they could neither support their children nor afford housing. Then there was the fear of being beaten or killed. The area of the karst was characterized by episodes of violence that also involved soldiers, especially at the country festivals and village dances. The socialist press clearly condemned the soldiers' behavior in this occasion. Their presence was perceived as a foreign element that gave rise to many quarrels, often because of girls who frequented the soldiers or who were erased verbally and physically by the soldier. The Italian authorities were also concerned, as shown by the circular of April 1919, signed by Pietro Badoglio, sub-commandant of the General Staff. Badoglio stigmatized the behavior of the officers in the territories of occupation, who flaunted relations with the local women or friendship lived lightly. According to Badoglio, these attitudes were perceived by the inhabitants, especially in the areas where there was more hostility. So he referred in particular in the majority of Croat and Slovenian region area. As a provocation and abuse by, quote, the rules towards those who were won and as challenge to religious sentiment, end of quote. News reports from Istria focus on dozens of assaults on isolated houses, and in few cases they talk about rapes and murders of owners' wives or sisters. All description highlight the fact that these bandits were dressed in Austro-Hungarian or Italian army clothes. Why? On one hand, we are faced with soldiers of the former imperial army who, not having work, become bandits. On the other hand, the use of uniforms of the Italian army served to gain the confidence of the inhabitants to open their doors with an excuse of controls. Around 10 cases identified in which women were raped. In other occasions, the article talked about attempt of violence, foiled by the opposition of the women themselves or the intervention of family members. In reality, there were the soldiers of the Italian army who committed violence, especially against single women or women with young children. These women were forced by violence to have a sexual relation. These events took place in different areas of Julian March, especially outside the towns. For example, on the 23rd of December 1922, in the municipality of San Pietro di Sonzo, close to Gorizia, 3 soldiers, along with 2 civilians, entered the house of sisters Maria and Clementina Kociancic. 2 soldiers raped the sisters. The civilians did not have time to abuse because in the confusion a soldier accidentally fired a rifle and in panic everyone fled. They were all identified. The soldiers were of the 7th Company in Turiaco. The other 2 were workers coming from Reggio Calabria. Sorry for the quality, but it was not so in the presentation. What were the reactions of the women? In Trieste there was a marked increase in suicide attempts and suicide. So much so that in 1920 Il Lavoratore used several times the title Il secolo dei neurasthenici, the neurasthenic century, or I volontari della morte, the volunteers of death. To get an idea of the extent of the phenomenon, in 1919 there were 37 cases of attempted suicide by women throughout the region. The following year, in the pages of Il Lavoratore, identified 7-8 articles, almost all of which occurred in Trieste alone, while there were 60 in 1921. The fascist newspaper Il Popolo di Trieste has several ironic comments pointing out that most of the attempts of suicides had a protagonist women because they were more inclined to disorder of the nervous system. It also believed that the attempts to take their own lives were in reality only acts aimed to obtain the attention and forgiveness of lovers and family members. In the newspapers, so also in Lavoratore, the other one, the recurrent motivation were for family sorrows, for sentimental issues, or for incurable disease or neurasthenia. The reasons are to be found in the living conditions. Many were poor women in debt or prostituted treated by the pimps. In other cases, we are faced with single women in cities who have lost their jobs, such as maids or seamstresses. One of the main causes was the abandonment by the lover, often a soldier who left without a trace. Where women become pregnant and were later abandoned, there were several cases in which they resort to abortion. In Trieste there are at least 24 cases that led to the arrest of women and also to the midwives, because abortion was considered by law as infanticide. One aspect that emerged from the press is the space dedicated to the different news. While domestic violence and suicide are bound in a few lines, large articles are dedicated to cases where the woman was the perpetrator of violence, or if there was something particular heinous in the crime, or if it was the subject of a chatter of gossip in the city. The morbidity with which these cases were followed is transversal to all publications, also demonstrating the interest of the public for these crime reports and for the most macabre details. It also always indicated when the victim was a prostitute, highlighting how, despite the marriage or the beginning of a love affair, had not redeemed, had not really changed life, an approach by journalists that tends to justify violence against them. In the cast areas and in Istria, however, we are witnessing several attempts by the young pregnant girls to escape from their village, to reach Trieste, other cities in the region, or where they can hide their pregnancy from their families and the community. This aspect is linked to the episode of infanticide reported by the press, which had as protagonists young girls, almost always left by soldiers with whom they had had a relationship. For example, Elena Sankovic from Dane ran away from home so as not to let people know about her pregnancy and killed her son immediately after giving birth. The child was the result of a relationship she had with a soldier from Bari, who had abandoned her. Another reaction, probably the main one, was that of silence and trauma experienced in solitude or within the home. What I have collected are only the episodes of the sources available to us, but we must believe that many others, probably the majority, have never been reported. In my opinion, a central aspect for understanding this phenomena, in addition to the question of a social and economical situation, must be found in the so-called moral question. This aspect, which also linked to the issue of illegitimate children, is sometimes referred to as the cause of certain suicide and infanticide. Morality was not linked to the sexual act itself, but to any behavior that deviated from the tradition, cultural, family, and society relationships. It was not so important what you did as what people knew and thought about your actions and relationships. Morality was a central element, especially in small rural areas. In the city, the moral aspect was linked above all to the possibility of losing jobs due to behavior that was not considered decent. For example, in Trieste, Valeria threw herself out of the window for, I quote, questions she had with her family because of rumors about her morality, end of quote. One last point I would like to mention is political violence, particularly the fascist one. Unlike the Kingdom of Italy, Julian March was characterized by the national question. Here were present internal enemies swaying during the First World War, namely the Slav and the German. This violence is not gender-based, but also affects women, an aspect often underestimated by historiography. From the pages of the fascist newspaper Il Popolo di Trieste, come to light a series of threats against the female post-telegraphist and Slovenian, Croats and German teachers, considered enemies of the Italian nation. Because they either did not use the Italian language at work or because they carry out political activities with the socialist or pro-Yugoslavian movement. The periodical published all the data of these women, name, surname, residence, making them targets for squadrismo. In the published articles, they were invited to leave not only their job, but also the Julian March, and to move abroad. If they had not done so, the fascists declared themselves ready to intervene to expel them from their office and schools, and also from the region. These episodes were followed by several expatriations, both to Austria and to Kingdom of Serbs, Croatia and Slovenia. A reaction due to the fact that these women had a higher level of education, greater mobility, and could could more easily find work in the new states. For example, in Gemino and Pisino, where Croatian schools were devastated, the three teachers, women, fled after being threatened. Another place that was affected is in the predominantly Slovenian Croatian areas were the taverns, several of them run by women, where the socially and Yugoslavian nationalists had meeting. To conclude, violence against women was certainly a constant fact in the life of the region. What changes is in this phase of transition is certainly the strong presence of the military and the repercussion that this has on love, social and family relationships. The relations that the military established in the occupied territories after the conflict are unstable and give rise to reactions such as suicide and infanticide, dictated by the fear of having raised an illegitimate child alone or by the fear of having compressed their moral in front of relatives and community, especially in the rural areas. In addition, violence is manifested in the return of veterans, both in the action of brigandage with the resulting violence in Istria, and in domestic violence and murders in the city, where it is not accepted that girlfriend or wife have established new sentimental or sexual relationship. Usually, after conflict, there is an increase in reports to the authorities, given the confidence placed in the occupier, who is supposed to want to control and stabilize the region, especially after an initial phase of disorder and the replacement of powers. Can we say the same in this case? Was there confidence in the new occupier? I suppose that in particular in Karst and Istria were not. It will also be interesting to compare the crimes in the pages of the periodicals and thus that emerged from the report of the authorities to understand what was disclosed and what was preferred to keep confidential. I would like to point out that the lack of attention paid to this violence is due to a number of factors. As I have said, there was a silence on the part of the victims on moral and honor grounds, as well as an account of the difficulty of elaborating the traumas. The study of hospital and psychiatric sources provided for in the project will certainly shed a new light on the relationship, on the reactions and processing by the victims. The passage of authority between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Kingdom of Italy is often presented as a moment that puts an end to the violence, in stark contrast to what these episodes tell us. Nationalist rhetoric has long presented soldiers and veterans as heroes, protecting their image as symbol of the nation and the sacrifice made during the conflict. Moreover, in the national imagination, the centrality of Trieste and the Terra Redente, redeemed territories, have a very strong patriotic value that cannot be tainted by episodes of violence, especially if they involve the military. There are many points of investigation, but settling all these episodes should be analyzed in the light of the Slovenian and Croatian language press of Julian March, and in the case of political violence, also in the press of Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, where those who were persecuted sought refuge. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Matteo, also for being so disciplined with time. Makes my job much easier. Our last speaker on this panel is Tina Bahovec, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Eastern and Southeastern European History at the Alpen Adria University in Klagenfurt, Selovec. Her research focuses on ethnicity, nationalism, and gender in modern Southeastern Europe and the Alpine Adriatic region. Her publications include Love for the Nation in Times of War, Strategies and Discourses of the National and Political Mobilization of Slovene Women in Carinthia from 1917 to 1920, in the volume Gender and the First World War, which appeared in 2014. Her paper for today is entitled The South Slavic Rape of the Occupied Carinthian Territory, Violent Words and Violent Deeds in the Border Conflict in Carinthia after World War I. Please proceed.
Thank you. At the end of World War I, both the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes and the Republic of German Austria claimed the southern part of Carinthia, where Slovene speakers made up for 69% of the population. A military conflict over the disputed territories between autumn 18 and summer 1919 prolonged the wartime conditions in the area and resulted in parts of Carinthia being liberated, respectively occupied by Yugoslav forces. Finally, the border question was resolved, as it's known, by a plebiscite, where Austria won 59% of the vote in the plebiscite zone A, and Yugoslavia 31%. Thus, Carinthia as a whole became part of Austria. Although next year marks the 100th anniversary of the plebiscite, Slovene and Austrian historiography and public memory are still predominantly androcentric. This is even more true for questions of gender violence. Rape, children born out of wanted or unwanted relationships with the enemy, or women as perpetrators of violence are sparsely researched. Major publications or search through various databases yield little results. Therefore, my presentation as a preliminary overview identifies some aspects and questions connected to violence on symbolic levels and in reality. I suggest that various types, means and functions of violence in intersection with gender and ethnicity can be examined. during the military struggle over the disputed territories, during the lead-up to the plebiscite, and of course in the aftermath of the plebiscite. Today I will focus on the years 18 to 20 to outline violence by women, violence against women, and voluntary or involuntary, respectively violent relationships and sexual intercourse with friends and foes. And I will utilize sources such as newspapers, autobiographical materials, parish chronicles, or a work of historical fiction. When dealing with the armed border conflict, historiography and remembrance often focuses on men, reinforces hegemonic manliness as patriotic and militaristic. Women's participation in various levels and forms is less researched and remembered. As the armed conflict in Carinthia had elements of a civil war, the lines between soldiers and civilians, front or hinterland, were blurred to non-existent, and women were quite often involved. Similarly, also the lines between the ethnic or national groups were blurred, and the boundaries of us versus them often defined by other than national or language affiliations. First, the example of two parish chronicles, how they depict women's participations and experiences. According to the Chronicle of Gdynia, under Yugoslav rule, a woman was arrested because a man denunciated her that she supposedly was firing shots through the window at the Slovene soldiers. But the priest added that this is unlikely, and she was indeed released the next day. The parish chronicle from Kasaze is interesting because the priest fled with the retreating Serbian army, and his sister added her memoirs about events in May 1990, a rare female account. She mentions the looting by the Austrian military Volkswehr, and also mentions how women were waiting for the loot that they were promised from the parochial house. Furthermore, she paints the picture of a village united in defense against the looters. Men and boys armed themselves and stood guard in the village, whereas 3 girls were sent to the church spire to be on the lookout for such visitors and then ring the bell, which they did and managed to scare away such soldiers. Next is a voluminous Austrian collection of over 100 memorialist reports published for the plebiscite anniversary in 1930, which includes only 6 reports by women, but various accounts about women. One of the accounts about women, under the title Brave Women, describes women's actions in Hamburg. It portrays the resistance of an entire people, regardless of gender and age. It gives the example of a fearless woman who spoke Slovene, but cursed at the looting Yugoslav soldiers and actually intimidated them with her brave behavior. After one of the male defenders had died in battle, it reports, I quote, "A dashing girl, Christina, took his rifle and ammunition and was firing without cover against the enemy. During the fight, boys were carrying ammunition, and girls and women provided medical service." Quite traditional gender roles. Other accounts describe Grete Schodebeck, probably the most prominent feature in public memory, with streets named after her, for example, in Klagenfurt-Slavics. She was said to have looked after the wounded, always following straight after the fighters, and when a field gun had to be left behind due to the murderous enemy fire, she volunteered to save the cannon that could be only reached passing through the enemy curtain fire. Schodebeck is one of the 13 women and girls that died in the so-called Abwehrkampf defense on the Austrian side, alongside with 253 men. For the 20th anniversary of the plebiscite in 1940, a newspaper wrote about the Carinthian woman in the defense, describing how she fought, bled and died for the homeland, labeled then, of course, the German soil. Apart from patriotic propaganda, it vividly shows the brutality of the fights. Injuries, namely, I quote, artery shell shots that teared up the body, or the death struggle, when a woman lay there, hit by the murderous projectile, far away from her loved ones, all alone and helpless in her last struggle. End of quote. It also mentions the still present traces of the past fights on the bodies of the women, that is, wounds. some women still today wear the scars of enemy bullets, artillery shells, and shrapnel. End of quote. Around 300 women later received the Carinthian Cross, a decoration for bravery. The Carinthian Provincial Archive has comprehensive material about these decorations, including the list of 317 women, but little research has been done on them. The fighting and the occupation or liberation were accompanied by various changes in military and political or state authorities, who often threatened or exerted violence in various forms, including harassment, mistreatment, detention, taking of hostages, expulsion, legal persecution perceived as unjust witness justice, etc. Of course, also women were subject to such forms of violence, as I want to illustrate with two Austrian newspaper reports that are also interesting because of the ascribed national affiliations. In January 1920, the Austrian Freie Stimmen stated that a woman who declared herself a Slovene but was suspected to be Carinthian-minded experienced a lesson on Serbian brutality on her own body. When she tried to cross the demarcation line without valid documents, she was arrested and, quote, mistreated so badly that up to this day she does not dare to leave the house because of the disgrace of carrying the Yugoslav colors on her body, meaning she had red and blue bruises. For the newspaper, this was the proof how the Serbs treat Carinthians, even if they are Slovene. The second example is from a recollection of a woman published alongside others for, again, an anniversary of a plebiscite in a women's newspaper supplement. Entitled In Yugoslav Captivity, a self-ascribed German woman and loyal Carinthian talks about house searches, a temporary arrest by Yugoslav soldiers who pushed her around and spat on her, her ensuing sleepless nights, and finally how she and her husband were arrested and transferred to the regional court in Julian, where she was sentenced to 8 months of imprisonment due to charges of theft, espionage, sacrilege, high treason, and desecration of corpses. The next chapter, the violence in the plebiscite propaganda. If peace is the continuation of war with other means, as Marta Veginella has reminded us, this is very true of the pre-plebiscite period as a type of continuation of the armed border conflict. Contemporaries and historians alike refer to this time as the propaganda war, the intellectual battle for the plebiscite, the intellectual defense, the battle with pamphlets and printed works. First, I want to highlight the usage of the German term Vergewaltigung, rape, in Austrian propaganda, when it was not directly referring to sexualized violence against women. I want to apply Angela Koch's historical analysis of rape discourses to the Carinthian case. Koch underlines the interconnectivity of the female body and the collective and traces the shifting etymological meanings of Vergewaltigung, which included, respectively connoted meanings of power, dominance, coercion, defilement, dishonor, also robbing, hence the later judicial term raptus preserved in the English term rape. As a major semantic field, Koch identified the violent and illegitimate subjugation and intrusion into the rights and properties of others, namely in the context of territorial and political unions. And I suggest that these meanings feature prominently in Austrian discourses on occupied Carinthia, its territory, its people, and the nature of Yugoslav rule. So, for example, Freie Stimmen wrote about the occupied and raped lowlands. They published an official communication of the Carinthian Landesrat about the state of things under the title, The South Slavic Rape of the Plebiscite Zone A. They printed a pro-Austrian resolution of a municipal committee which greeted the disenfranchised and raped brothers in the parts of our homeland that are still occupied by the Yugoslavs. The paper complained about the unprecedented rape of the Carinthian will of the people and asked, is there still justice in Europe, or are the South Slav politicians of violence and conquest allowed to shamelessly rape the free, peace-loving people? Furthermore, this terminology was also applied to other German lands under foreign, South Slavic or other rules, such as raped southern Styria, poor raped Marburg, Maribor, or raped Gochea, Kochelia. In connection with territory, I want secondly briefly touch upon visualized violence against female personification of the territory with 3 Austrian examples that also portray menacing soldiers. The first example shows the fair-haired Carinthia gagged with a muzzle and chained by Yugoslav soldiers, and the caption suggests that this is how the Yugoslavs envisage a free plebiscite. In the second example, the valley of Mezica, which became part of Yugoslavia after the war, is depicted as a young girl tied to a tree guarded by the dark Yugoslav soldier. The newspaper asked her to not give up hope, thus indicating a revisionist claim to it. And the last example is from the mural The Carinthian Land and Its Enemies from renowned Carinthian artist Lobisa, where the land, that is the woman, is endangered by its armed enemies throughout history, from the Romans, the Huns, the Ottomans and the French to the Slavs. Thirdly, I want to highlight violence, namely threats and physical attacks against women as organizers and participators in the plebiscite preparations. Famous Carinthian Slovene Milka Hartmann was a leading figure of interwar women's organizations and actively engaged in both border conflicts after the war. In 1947, the Slovene women's magazine Naša žena published her article about the fight of Carinthian women for the national rights of the Carinthian Slovenes. And in this article, she of course emphasized women's activism before the plebiscite, saying, I quote, "The Carinthian woman risked everything during the plebiscite period: health and life, love and wealth, spared time and several hours-long routes." And furthermore, she mentions that we national conscious girls received malicious, vituperative and threatening letters, for example, "We wish it upon you that they learn to drum on you," that is, on your body. The last example is connected with the Slovene Association of Women's Societies in Carinthia. They were a major mean for women's involvement, and the activities of these societies were widely and often aggressively discussed. Some reports stated that women did not participate out of their free will, but they were forced to join. And members of these women's societies also encountered physical attacks, as a constable report shows. On the way home from a women's gathering in the village of Blato, I quote, about 10 lads, allegedly armed in part with sticks, in part with stones, attacked the passing wagons and threw stones at the girls. One of the lads was allegedly armed with a gun and a dagger. A quarter of an hour later, members of another women's society were attacked in the same way with stones, and they were doused in water. The report lists 9 women and their various injuries to the head, to the back, or to the hands and arms. The perpetrators were labeled as German-oriented lads who had planned a meeting but cancelled due to the unexpected women's meeting, and, as the constable sums up, they attacked the frail and innocent women out of revenge. Now the final chapter. As stressed by Hugo Davies and others, the boundaries of national communities are symbolized, mediated and reproduced via women, respectively the female body. And women's sexual behavior plays an important role as national honor is constructed around women's honor. If we first focus on voluntary relationships, we can see how sexual standards prescribe women to choose their sexual partners among members of their own national group and reject the enemy. Therefore, voluntary sex with men of the enemy was repudiated, whereas it was encouraged with men of one's own nation. Also, the Catholic Church was allegedly playing its part by judging and guiding women's sexual conduct according to national interest, and in this context also discussing sexual intercourse with regard to the biological reproduction of the nation. I want to show this with a few examples. So, the Austrian newspaper quoted the Sunday sermon of an Austrian priest who urged the men, addressed as the former defense fighters, to punish the sexual misconduct of women who were labeled as whores. I quote, "You men and boys who have fought so bravely, pilloried a horse who prowled with the South Slavs and had intercourse with them. Forgive me this expression from the pulpit, but they are whores and will remain whores until the earth from which they have sprouted will have covered them. End of quote. Another article gives an interesting example where sexual behavior, various forms of sanctioning and violence intersect. A farmhand had allegedly beating up his lover because she prowled around at night with the Yugoslav military. A woman voiced her opinion that a girl that messes around at night with a Chushan, a pejorative term for Slavs, should not be beaten up but battered to death. Therefore, the public prosecutor in Ljubljana started investigation into this, and apparently this woman was sentenced to 9 months of prison. A report of the Austrian propaganda organization noted with outrage that a Slovene priest was preaching in church, I quote, "All young girls, widows and women should have intercourse with Yugoslav soldiers so that the Yugoslav state soon will be strong and populated. Then we will be able to destroy the fake Germans, and in a few years all of Carinthia, Fiume, Trieste and Gorizia will be ours." End of quote. And when a 15-year-old girl was confessing and lamented that Yugoslav soldiers do not leave her in peace and follow her around wherever she goes, the priest allegedly answered, "My dear girl, do not resent the soldiers. It is allowed to have a relationship with our brothers. You will also receive relief for your sins." End of quote. As a footnote, male sexual misconduct served to denounce the moral inferiority of a fanatic Yugoslav priest who, according to a newspaper, loved especially the girls and could never refrain from creeping after the maidservants in the stables and pet them there. End of quote. Of course, parish chronicles show a different side, namely priests who are concerned that soldiers, no matter the nationality, have a bad influence on order and morality in general, and women in particular. For example, the priest in Vogarce, where the soldiers were mainly Carniolans, wrote, "What influence the presence of the military had on the girls, one can easily imagine. Quite a few had their corona virginitatis, their crown of virginity, swept away by the river Drava, the power of the uniform." The Austrian side repeatedly referred to relationships and marriage as a means of Yugoslav propaganda, and also broached the issues of pregnancy. A report of the Austrian propaganda organization stated that girls who were before firmly on the side of the German Austria are lured into proposals of marriage and engagement, and with them the whole family gets snared. Similarly, the newspaper Stigma wrote that South Slav officers and soldiers tried to establish intimate relationships with girls and women in order to gain a bigger influence on the seduced population. End of quote. Such incidents are also depicted in an Austrian caricature entitled "The Happiness and the End of the Chushan Katla," or in the Slovene version of the caricature that you can see here, "The Serbian Katra." Mirko promises clumsy Katra to marry her if she votes for Yugoslavia. Silly Katra believes him, dreams she's in seventh heaven, thinking that her Mirko will become a Yugoslav general. But there is no happy end. Mirko has rapidly taken to his heels and left grieving Katra, who will give birth to a child and wash diapers at a cold well. Therefore, the poem warns, Carinthian girls, the dishonest Chush is not a bridegroom. Finally, I want to focus on sexualized violence. Austrian and Slovene sources repeatedly talk about assaults, attempted assaults, and rape committed mostly by soldiers. Of course, often this is part of national communication and propaganda, where the enemy men are humiliated because they cannot protect their women, or the enemy men are constructed as faux images of brutal rapists, where the age or other attributes of the victims, such as pregnancy, play an important role. Often accounts do not stress so much the sexual violence that the woman had to endure, but make women as wives and daughters appear as property of the man, whose property rights and honor are violated. On the Austrian side, a published official communication of the Carinthian Landesrat spoke of numerous rapes of women by Yugoslav soldiers. And in the newspaper Freie Stimmen, we read quite open accounts such as the following. A head teacher and his wife were led away by soldiers, and their only daughter, a 15-year-old, was defiled. A German innkeeper was tied down, and his wife, his daughter, and a waitress were raped in his presence, which was said to be a proof for the bestiality of Serb soldiers. A report of the Austrian propaganda organization depicts an attempted assault. So apparently in the morning, inebriated Yugoslav officers paid a visit to the house of Miss S and O. They harassed the girls, who fled, but were caught by the officers at the entrance door. After their cries for help, Miss S appeared and saved the girls from the impending violation by the Yugoslav culture bearers, of course meant ironically. And by the way, in the Austrian propaganda against the Yugoslav military, also cases of rapes of women, particularly waitresses, in Slovenia by Albanian recruits were reported. On the Slovene side, the newspaper Yugoslavia in May 1919 described the situation in Slovene Carinthia as a continuation of German atrocities in the World War, saying, I quote, "The barbaric German kills our men and boys, attacks our children, defiles and tortures our women and girls in horrendous ways, forces our people into prison, and robs our homes and our land." End of quote. Another article about the rule of the German hordes in Carinthia stated, "Under the violence of the German savages, Slovene girls suffer a lot. They are violated regardless of their age. Even girls under the age of 14 are not safe." End of quote. In Grebin, German soldiers tried to rape a waitress from an inn, but the girl managed to flee. In another inn, they were said to pester the maid, who managed to flee, and they were shooting after her as she did not want to surrender to them. Another report from Voberske Gore shows a distinct sequence of events with regard to the violation of property. A German patrol came to a tenant, quote, "forced him to hold the bag which the soldiers filled up with meat stolen from the farmer. They preyed upon his wife, who fled through the window, but the soldierly mob stormed after her, caught her, and raped her in a nearby bush. The woman was pregnant." End of quote. In addition, there's also reports, for example, by an Austrian consul who describes the conduct of the Austrian military Volkswehr in spring 1919 and mentions the raping of women. My last example is a work of fiction, but historical fiction, so to speak, written by renowned Carinthian Josef Friedrich Bekonig, who was himself actively engaged in the plebiscite propaganda. It is called Heimsuchung, Tragödie in Kärnten, roughly translates to Plague, a tragedy in Carinthia. It was written in March 1920 and premiered in June of the same year in Klagenfurt-Zellowitz. It portrays the fate of a pro-Austrian farmer's family. The farmer is expelled, the young son is dying of wounds from the border fight, the farmer woman is looking after household and family. She's at her breaking point and thus at some point succumbs to the Slovene priest, who also represents the local political authority, and pressures her to swear to vote for Yugoslavia. However, I want to focus on the figure of the maid, who is introduced as pale, with red-rimmed eyes and somewhat clumsy movements. When she turns out to be pregnant, the farmer woman is supportive. She consoles her, saying, "It can happen to every girl in love. A child is a gift from the Lord." But the maidservant replies, "It is from the devil, a gift of hell." Through her following outburst, we learn that she was raped by an unknown soldier in the dark of the barn. She did not see his face, does not know his name. Therefore, she can't go to court like the farmer woman suggests. The violence of the raped is described by the force of her resistance. I quote, "I jammed my claws into his throat. I kicked my feet into his stomach. I bit him in the hands. I shouted like mad. No one heard me." End of quote. And what does she say about the baby? she says. I will tear it out with my own hand. I will drink soap water, eat ergo. I don't want a child, not a child like this. End of quote. Act 2 of the tragedy starts with people searching for the maid, respectively her corpse. In the deep pond, apparently she committed suicide. This also entails a discussion if the poor soul, or sinner, may be buried in the graveyard. A newspaper critique after the premiere about Carinthia's suffering on stage in form of tragedy subsumes the maidservant's fate in one sentence. The maid raped by a band of soldiers cannot bear the consequences of the act of violence and goes into the water. End of quote. Thus the figure of the maid gives a voice, although fictional, to a raped woman, but of course it also serves as a propagandistic symbol, more precisely the embodiment of the rape of Carinthia by the South Slavs, in the sense of an unjust and forceful foreign domination, as explicated above. Thus, coming full circle, some concluding thoughts. While I pointed out various types of symbolic and real violence with examples, much still remains to be done. Documents by administrative and political bodies, by military authorities, inquiries after the fights and after the plebiscite by Austrian or Yugoslav or Allied commissions, court material, etc., has to be re-examined and re-evaluated for the topic of gender-specific violence. One has to ask, what happened to pregnant girls like Katra from the caricature and their babies after the plebiscite? And more general, what happened to the woman who stayed in Carinthia or had to leave it? Furthermore, comparative aspects merit a closer look. For example, were the Slav territories occupied by Italy after World War I similarly portrayed as the raped homeland, as we have seen for Carinthia? And in how far was gender-specific violence in Carinthia in the aftermath of World War II similar to the time after World War I? On the one hand, during the short period when Yugoslav troops again liberated, respectively occupied southern Carinthia. On the other hand, during the new border struggle, which was again accompanied by mass mobilization of women, by violence, also by British authorities, etc. As such, comparisons are one of the aims of this workshop. I'm looking further to our productive discussion, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Tina. And on that note, I open the floor for feedback, questions, and suggestions. Anybody? I do understand it's very early in the morning, so I might just abuse my... Are you taking the...
Yes, after you.
No. I was just trying to break the ice. Please, go ahead, Julia.
So, I have maybe some general questions for all of you, because I think you, sorry, in yours and yours of Meta and Tina, I saw for the first time, especially in Tina paper, emerges the role of the church with the parish chronics, and I wanted to know if also Meta and Matteo found something about the role of the church and the question of morality in this period. Because a part of the press you saw, Matteo, in Trieste, and then I have a question also for your sources, but of the materials, the sources you consulted, if you found something like Tina found, because I think that in this period we have some areas where parish are the only official presence of an institution, especially in the aftermath of the war. We know that this was important for Friuli, and I'm wondering if it's important also for the Julian March, or as we saw for Carinthia. This is the first. Then what I was thinking listened to your papers was what about some women association position just in this period after the war? Because we know that we had a group of nurses, and we had women of the assistants that they remained on the place. And did they help these women? Do we have something about it? Because no one of you spoke, and also yesterday, no one spoke about women, not yesterday, yes, but I'm connecting to First World War and Second World War, about women association. What happened? How did they face with the problem of women's suicide, rape, and so on? And then the role, I think that Tina pointed out very, very precisely, and I think it's really important, is the role of art and the drawings, painting in the propaganda. Did you find also, Matteo and Meta, some examples like Tina found on the newspapers? Because the representation, the symbolization also of the Carinthia violated through the centuries, I think it's a collective mentality about what was going on. Okay, I think it's enough. Thank you.
Who wants to start?
I can say something about the priests. Of course, they are the ones who are making notes. They are the ones who are sending, as I said, the notes to the Archbishop Eirene. I did not find direct numbers or names. I found one priest, it's a fact from my hometown, from Julian, from Eirene. He keeps sending brief notes of a mother who is selling her 11 and 13 and then later 13 and 15-year-old girls to the soldiers. But he's not really indignated about the young age of the girls. He's not worried about the age because they are already morally corrupted. So for him, it's not a fact of the age. It's scandalous. There are riots, there are fights in front of the house, so the public officials should stop it. The girls are affected. He mentions that they both been treated for gonorrhea, the young ones, but he shows no special mercy for the girls. So of course they all express their concerns. But my opinion with the priest that I got, which was based on the fact that soldiers were given advice on how to prevent sexually transmitted diseases, that they were advised on how to use a condom and so on. They were more afraid that this knowledge would spread than of protecting the soldiers, and so their action was to hush everything. So yeah.
Thank you.
My comment.
So about church and priest, there are studies about the national question and the Yugoslav movement. No, about morality, we need to check in the Curia sources, of course. Still now I have work only these sources that I say before, so newspaper and. But about the women association, there are many in this year because they grew up after the war, and some is a continuity before. Like, for example, the association against the trade of white slavery. And the other one, interesting, is the 12 servants that arrived in Trieste from the Kingdom of Italy. And this association was to prevent that these servants become prostitutes. And so they help with food and with apartment or place to sleep. And there are also some socialist campaign in the laboratory. We found a lot about that against alcoholics. The plug for the socialist was the alcohol, and it's a long one campaign, but it's start after the war, and that's it about that.
Yes, about the women's associations. While I was writing this, I was actually thinking, did the women's associations that existed in Carinthia or in Slovenia dealing with this border topics, did they actually use sexualized violence or rape as a rallying cry for to mobilize women? And then I read or reread a few of the sources that I had in speeches, but I didn't read it all, and I would have to go through it again, but I didn't find one yet where it would be kind of explicitly said, they are raped, they need our help, they need the support, so it seems to be still taboo. Of course, it was general about violence and support, and they received some money, and now when you asked that, I thought, oh, maybe some of this money was used, but I don't know that. By what I've read so far, I don't really know. And also, when you mentioned the associations, I was also thinking about like these various groups of women, which I, for example, didn't talk about, like the cooks of the priests in the parishes that had to maybe flee or were robbed, what happened to them, or also nuns in the sense of in Carinthia there were those školske sestre who had the schools, so what happened to them in this time. So there's still various also groups that need to be built into more, apart from associations, like also different groups.
I don't have any question, but I just want to mention that I forgot to tell yesterday that in Croatia was one association. The name was Guardian of the Girls, and it was open. It started to work 1924, but it helps the women from rural area who come to Zagreb. The association deals with the prevention of prostitution and so on. But the interesting thing is that none of the association that I know from that period help the people with mental disorder, especially women with mental disorder. And it is the women with mental disorder are is a very specific category of women, and that is why I'm interested in that category. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I was wondering when I was listening to you, because this was really a historical panel, if we can say, right? So your research is really based in history, which I think is super valued, specifically in terms of when you analyze all those sources. Can we even talk about consensual sexuality so long ago, let's say 19th century? Because it seems to me that everything what you find, I mean, there's lots of violence and there's lots of violent sexuality as such, and because marriage as such was for so long perceived as an economic institution rather than, I don't know, love, whatever, based relationship. So my question is, should we distinguish contemporary understanding of rape, also because legislation is super related to how we define it today and how we persecute it, to actually these even everyday analysis of life? And if historians could perhaps provide more comparative studies of, well, there is something we define as rape because it's so obvious, people were damaged, destroyed, they went to mental hospitals, and there is this other side, which is, I don't know, pleasant sex. Was there something like this? Because lots of sources actually that you read, also novels, I mean, I'm not sure if there's really something like consensuality.
So, there are a lot of, in newspaper you can find a lot of news about normal sex because it was like consensual sex between also soldier and girls and so on. But it was like when they have this article, long articles, you have a description before, during, after, and maybe during so one man, one girl were in somewhere, and arrived another man that make something wrong or crimes. But they talk quite normally about that, so it was not so hard to find.
Which years?
After First World War. So I watched the 4 years after the First World War. The point is that rape was not the point of the crimes. The crimes was violence. And the violence became crime when was the girl died or when the girl go to hospital for a long time. So, and the man was arrested. Because we can find a lot of notice, a lot of news, sorry, where the women arrive at the hospital, have the cure and go home or stay 1 or 2 days, and the men arrive and they go together at home, or the police was like in Italy now it was an article, il poliziotto pazzere, so the police that keep peace police that arrive and say you made a mistake, don't do again, and go home. So you have a lot of this. Every day you can find I don't know in English the word for carezze. Caress. They call this beaten caress in the newspaper. And I have not time today to talk about that, but we have a lot of these examples.
Maybe I can say that a rape was considered rape in peacetime if a woman was raped by, if she was really underage, but deeply underage, if she was raped by 3+ men at the time, at the same time, if she was from a bigger, higher social standard than the perpetrator, and if she could show real hard physical wounds. Otherwise, it was like letting off steam or something, or she provoked him and so on. But rape could not happen in marriage. So, consensual or not, if you were married to a man, you could not be raped by the husband. And so, as I mentioned, there is a similarity because especially young wives did not know what to expect. So they were all waiting for this third picture and were brutalized the year in the following days. So all the dream crashed because they usually depicted this, I don't know what they expected, but they usually say they didn't know what to expect. Their mothers, or they wonder, but with words which was saying, don't be afraid, it will be all over, don't fight it, he'll be probably drunk on the first night and won't succeed anyway. So the girls was, what? This experience inside marriage and later rape is it's pretty similar. So.
Yes, thank you. I was thinking actually the same thing this morning when I was going through, and I had this involuntary and voluntary, and then I was thinking, well, what's the continuum between, and how does it work? I mean, I obviously tried to show a bit, let's say, voluntary, more voluntary from the side of the woman than involuntary, but even if it's voluntary, because there's examples, if they did it to have a better life, to marry a nice guy and to have a better life, so is that voluntary? So it's really a problem of, yeah, it's a spectrum, and it's like all these problems of terminology and classification. It's really hard, and also you have then, like you say, contemporary, and then you have historical and all the different meanings, so it's like, it's an important point. Thank you.
Yes, just a little quote about this. I don't think it's even decided right now what is consensual and consent. I mean, from the debate that is going on in the United States, and when is consent given and how many times you have to give it. So anyway, but I have a question for all of you, because it's very interesting for me, because Nena will do more ethnography, and you have somewhat the privilege of looking at the past. You know, it's a double-edged. I understand. You miss something, but you will gain something. This latest scholarship on sexual violence and conflict is focusing on the fact that we've been using the expression rape as a tool of war too easily. It's not it's something not often based on evidence, but it's assumed. If there is rape, it must be a tool of war. And you know, scholars at Harvard and Yale have redefined this notion, saying, well, actually, rape as a tool of war almost never can be proven because you need a plan that is an intent that is known, that can be proven, while rape is most of the time a practice, something that happens and is tolerated by the army. We're talking about state armies, you know, armies, big armies. What is your, not what your impression, but what do you conclude from the evidence that you have, especially you, Meta, were making some comments about the fact that attacking civilians in World War II was also a way, it was planned in a way, it was intentional to humiliate and subjugate the population. So what can we answer to this new political science scholarship from a historical point of view? What is your...
I think Bruno yesterday read one of the circular notes that were read to the soldiers front about women, and it does exist during the Bulgarian occupation, so there are Bulgarian documents about women, about how to treat them. The Bulgarian church was deeply involved in this. They promoted these false marriages. So there are some evidence that it was intentional and planned. So, but otherwise, I do agree that there is a fine line between saying, oh, there are some incidents and on the battlefront that it was carried out on a massive scale or not, and if the incidents were connected between them and so on. There are also Bulgarian sources that try to defend themselves by saying, oh, what we have done, you Serbians have done it to us in 1913, and they make a list of all the things that the Serbian side has done in the previous wars, and how the Serbian leaders were involved with the accidents. So I guess that some proof can be found. Not sure for the later periods.
So my case is particular in the sense of that the Italian army arrived in the Julian March not for a temporary, but to annex the region, and they consider the region Italian. And also the people, the women that live there, were Italian or must become Italian in a short time. So the point is that I found these episodes, and the army was totally against. So the interesting is watch the process and what happens to this military. So we have some that was condemned to a sentence life, that I said before, but we also, how many times this soldier spent in prison, I don't know. If arrive an amnesty or something like that, we need to watch the process and this documentation to have an idea what the army did.
So you're not focusing on punishment. You haven't found consistent punishment.
Yes, in the newspaper.
Oh, in the newspaper.
Yeah.
Well,
I need to say Carinthian on relationship before the process.
Okay.
Relationship, sorry, records from the process.
Can I say just one remark that Austrian soldiers were warned that Serbian soldiers, only the first draft got uniforms, and that later on the Serbian state would so much collapse that it did not even give uniforms to its soldiers. So they warned them, and they did a specific command: everyone who is outside the village is considered a target. So you cannot distinguish between a Serbian soldier and a Serbian civilian, so treat them equally, without exception of age or sex. So.
Thank you.
It's more remarks and thoughts, not really an answer, because the Carinthian situation is again different, because it's more civil war and different units and irregular units and volunteers, and it's more chaotic. So who would use that tool against who, especially if you think, I mean, if they come there, let's say a Serb Slovene, is he going to ask the girl, are you Slovene, do you feel Slovene, then I will leave you alone, or are you German, and I'm going to rape you? So this makes it so much kind of complicated and confusing, and I see, thus far, I see more the side where it's used as a propaganda tool, the alleged or definite rapes that happen, they're used as a propaganda tool, but not as such as a strategy, because I think who would have this strategy in a situation like unclear who is who and where's the border and it changes and regular, irregular units, and maybe also I was just thinking now, because we discussed honor also a lot, the honor of the soldier. If a Slovene volunteer went to Carinthia with the idea, I will free the people, then he maybe was more honorable and treated the population better, because he thought he had an honorable cause. I don't know, it's just some thoughts.
Yes, thank you very much for all presentations. I have one question for Meta and another for Matteo. The first question is about the brutality and South Slavs, because I think this discourse is also an Orientalist discourse, Orientalism, because we have naturally a very long durée violence or practice of violence in the Balkan area, but we could really speak about this predisposition of brutality in this area, because at the beginning of your paper you quote yes. This is the first question, because the question about the brutality we know is present also in the period of the Second World War, and also this political use of the border history, because the Slavs were brutal, and but we know that the post-war violence also in a region as Emilia-Romagna was very high, but today is now present in the Italy and in Italian political discourse. No? This question about the brutality. The second is about this border pass. Matteo, you mentioned this presence of Italian army in, and I think that this area is very, very important also in this topic of violence, because the security or insecurity in the military environment and also in the civilian environment was very, very high. And part of also the psychiatric documents, I found cases about the women and about the women who lived near the soldiers and had fear, a big fear, because were without defense, man defense, and so on. And I don't know if you found more data about the violence
violent events in this area of North, and if the Italian press wrote also about cases in this part of border area.
Basically, we have these great documents about what is going on the Balkan borders by Rodolphe Archibald Rice, who started making notes during the war. He opened the mass graves, counted the victims, he collected data about rapes with names like Rada Georgievich, wife of aged, what happened, her, and he collected those testimonies immediately after, and so on. He really got involved with the Serbian side. He presents himself as a Swiss man, objective and so on, but he got really on the Serbian side. And he makes every effort to present Serbians as innocent victims. He does not mention what happened before, and he's really quiet. So what is interesting is to read the Bulgarian documents, which were later sent to the Paris peace treaty, and because they accuse the Serbians of what I have said. You are accusing us of something, you have done this before. So we can basically observe the same methods, the same kind of violence throughout the whole century, but only the perpetrators and the victims are shifting. So in one period we have the perpetrator is a Serbian against the Muslim. Later on there is the violent Muslim, then there is the violent Bulgarian, and so on. So Magnus Hirschfeld at one point said, oh, there are ethnic disputes, we do not understand them, just we have to leave them alone, not to get involved. And he also says that there are the ethnic disputes are without comparison with other fronts. So what was going on, it was somehow not possible to understand for a Western. Also because of the mixed ethnicity of the people who were married, these mixed marriages. So these children are Serbians, are Croats, what are they? We have to really carefully read the sources, because if you only take those Rice's testimonies and without knowing what happened before, you get this feeling that the crimes committed against the Serbians are something unique and special, but they are really not.
Just because...
I suppose that people can say something.
No.
I can answer, or you can. I suppose you want to say something about. Okay. So about the border, the press don't help us about that theme, because, for example, in Popolo di Trieste was concentrated. All the newspapers were concentrated about Trieste city center in particular. So the city. The Popolo di Trieste was concentrated also in Istria, and in Piccolo instead in Friuli and Gorizia part. About the border, we have not a lot of news in the newspaper, but in the documents of Governatorato Militare, I found this information from the other type. I saw two types of documentation. The second type was about the border, so we have only list of crimes. And in these crimes, I found also this military that killed not only women, of course, they kill a lot of men. The difference, interesting difference, is that normally the women move in group or not alone, and with not a lot of stuff. A difference with men that was like a black market, regular black market in the border. And the other question is that the governatore had a problem with Longatico, Longatis, yes, but for the sources, yes, where there are a lot of movement, and every day they needed to check all the passport and the permission to move in Venezia Giulia, Julian March. You know that Julian March was like closed during this year, so you need passport to move also to Kingdom of Italy and both to Slovenia and Austria, so to the Kingdom of Slovenia and Austria also. So they have this in the Longati they have a lot of problem about that. They write a lot of time that every day the people spend hours to control the documentation, and a lot of people work and lived in the border zone.
Like double owners.
Final question.
Yeah, it's just, I think what Marta briefly mentioned, this Orientalism. The problem I see here is that we have lots of sources and lots of historic evidence on sexuality and violence in Balkans from so-called Western travelers, particularly from UK, and Hirschfeld, for instance, is really one of the most important and recognized sources, but I think he's also very problematic, especially if we, how we contextualize his work, right? Because if we do not put the remarks on Orientalistic or Balkanistic, if you want, imaginary, then we can reproduce really this idea that, you know, these Balkans are savages, and this is problematic specifically because it is then used I mean, this literature is used as a base for new wars. So, yeah, I think this.
Thank you very much for the question in our panel, and on that note, we have coffee, I think.